are so excited tonight because Chris Nytch is going to be leading us. He's done a master's degree project in the school forest. And he's learned more about the school forest than any of the rest of us know, so it'll be fun to hear what he says. And I also want to tell you that we are going to be, I don't know if you read the paper last week about Emerson's weekend, place program weekend, which was very successful. They had over 100 people come to the Friday night program, and 80 or so stayed for all day Saturday, and they did a lot of discussion of what they think Dummerston should look like and in the future. And so we would like to do something like that as well. But we're thinking that because we've had such a good time and turnout with all of these programs, that we would have a party to start with. And so our tentative plan is to have a party, and we hope to invite anybody you know, and bring yourselves. And then on Saturday we would do some discussion about Putney and what we've been doing here on the place programs, and having a more serious time. But everybody's invited if you bring your friends, but mostly we need some people to help us plan it. So if we can get some volunteers, that would be wonderful. And if some of you are interested in doing that, please let us know tonight or in the future. You can let Steve and Louise Backler know, or you can let me know, or Claire, Dacey, and we will put you on the list and we will invite you to come and help us plan. So please do that. The school forest is a very important part of our landscape, and to have the kind of investigation that Chris did over the last months, how many months, since January or before that, it's really special for us. So I want to welcome Claire tonight, who's going to do a little speaking, which I think you've all heard her do that before, and it's wonderful. And Chris. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Jackie. I want to say thank you again for all coming. It's great to see you here tonight. It's great to see familiar faces. I feel like I'm starting to know all of you. Thank you, Anne. I just want to give you a little sense of the flow of tonight's talk. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes in the beginning, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chris Nytch, who Jackie was talking about, our UVM grad student, and he will give really the meat of the talk. And then we'll have a break, and I'm going to come back at the end and talk a little bit more. Tonight we're focusing on the plant and animal communities that we share the landscape with here in Putney. And as usual, I'd like to extend some thanks. As always, many people's knowledge have funneled into these events. And some of these folks are local folks, also Kim Royer from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Philip Hamilton from the Putney Mountain Association has given us some information about vernal pool monitoring. Alex Jones. Alex, are you here tonight? Alex is an Antioch graduate student who also gave us some information. And Molly Cook, local hunter and very knowledgeable about wildlife. And as always, our excellent place program volunteer team and Chris Nytch, our grad student, who will be talking tonight. So we left off our last presentation, I know many of you were there, talking about the agricultural history of Putney and how agriculture changed in Putney really dramatically from the 19th century to today. And one of the big stories in that being the precipitous and steady decline of farms, not only in Windham County, but here in Putney as well. And as those farms, as the smaller farms have shut down and land use has changed in Putney, there's been a dramatic change on the landscape that's gone along with that. This is a picture from probably right around 1900, maybe late 1800s, of Putney. I believe we're looking down towards the center of the village, and you can see what a cleared landscape it was at that time period. This is another shot. I'm not actually sure where this picture was taken from, but this is also in Putney. I was thinking that might be Bear Hill there, but I'm not sure. Does anybody have a thought about that? Okay, well, we'll call it Bear Hill for now. Looking at quite bare. But as those farms across the landscape shut down over the last 100, 150 years, the forests have grown back, and the landscape of Putney today is really different. These pictures are all from a flyover we did in a small plane, and you can see how forested the landscape is. This is a shot looking across 91 from the east towards the center of Putney there, and here's the Sackettsbrook Valley. Very forested all around. This is the Putney Mountain ridge line looking north to Mount Scottney, and this is looking down towards the Sackettsbrook Valley from the north, from around Westminster. And you can see that there still are patches of open fields interspersed in the now largely forested landscape. Well, it turns out that this history of the clearing and the regrowth of the forest has left a stamp on the forests that we have here in Putney and throughout New England today. Trees are really long-lived, and so they have this incredible capacity to tell stories of the past. And there's a number of different ways that the forests of Putney tell the story of the agricultural past and how different the landscape was 100 years ago. These two trees are trees that grew up when the landscape was still open. Trees that grow in the forest don't branch low like this. They grow up trying to get to the light because it's shady. So when you see a tree in the forest, a big tree like this with low spreading branches, you could be sure that it grew up without other trees around it. It grew up in the open. And sometimes you see these ancient decaying hulks of, this is a sugar maple that was really a massive tree, and you can see it had all these low branches too, and it's falling apart in the middle of the woods. And this was probably a tree that was a pasture tree left in an open pasture to provide shade for animals. And the forest has grown up around it. So this is one way that agricultural past has left a mark on the forest today. But it's also changed some of the forest composition, the different species that we find and where we find them. It turns out that a lot of the species are responding to the past land use history because trees have different methods of dispersing their seeds. They have different abilities to grow out in the sun or in the shade. And so these past land uses have had a big effect on how the forests have grown back. This is a picture from Putney Mountain looking east. I'm not sure the exact date on this, but it's probably the early 1900s. And you can see that there are pastures here that are growing back. They've been abandoned or they're close to abandonment. And they are covered in white pines at various stages of growth. And this is a really common pattern. White pine is an excellent colonizer of abandoned pasture. For one thing, they love to grow in full sunlight. And another thing is that the cows don't really like to eat them. So when the cows are grazing these fields, they're eating all the little hardwood seedlings that come up, and they're avoiding the white pines. And then when the farmers start to abandon the field, they no longer go in there and take out the white pines that are starting to colonize. So they end up being they get a head start in these abandoned pastures. So a lot of places in Putney today where you see stands of white pine, that's actually a remnant from the past history of that patch of land as a pasture. This is an example of a stand of white pines that is associated with an agricultural past. And one thing that a lot of these pines often display is this sort of multi-branching structure. And that's actually caused by an insect called the white pine weevil that feeds on the growing tip and causes the plant to form multiple trunks. And they often attack white pine that are growing out in the open. So again, the weeveling, the funky branching of these pines is another remnant of the fact that these trees grew up in an open setting as opposed to the forested setting that's there today. This graph comes from a really fascinating study that was done about the forests of New England. And in this study, unfortunately, it's hard to compare our forests today with the forests that were here before we came, because there weren't ecologists back then who were taking account of exactly what the forest composition was like. But a very clever ecologist by the name of Charlie Cogbill came up with a really interesting solution to that problem. He found data that was basically when the settlers were first arriving and they were surveying the original plots of land, they used trees as boundary markers, and they made records of those trees that were along the boundary lines. And those records still exist, and they give us a picture of what the composition of the forest was like at that time. This graph is for the whole state of Vermont, showing what the composition of the forest was like from this, they were called witness trees, this witness tree data. And a couple things really stand out as being different from Vermont forests today. One of those things is the incredible prevalence of beech on the landscape. 36% of Vermont forests were beech pre-settlement based on this data. And the number today is much smaller. I'm not sure the exact number. I imagine it might be more like 15%. And beech is a long-lived tree that tends to grow in an established forest as opposed to colonizing open territory. And so beech is a little slower coming back into its predominance on the landscape. Pine, on the other hand, you can see is really just a tiny sliver. And many Vermont towns today have much more white pine than they did before this settlement. And that's just what I was just talking about with the pines being really good at colonizing these former pasture lands. Well, along with the return of the forests, there's also been a return of a wide diversity of wildlife that are associated with forested habitats. This map is from a very casual solicitation of wildlife sightings in Putney that we did at the town meeting this year. So this isn't meant to be scientific in any way, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the diversity of some of the critters that people are fairly regularly running into around town. Give you a sense of the way interactions with wildlife is part of the experience of Putney today in a way that it wouldn't have been at all 100 years ago. Folks are seeing black bear, moose, mink, turkey, red fox, otter, fisher, and that's just what people reported. Some things were too ubiquitous to even warrant reporting, such as whitetail deer, raccoons, and animals like that. This graph is an estimation of how a population of particular wildlife species has changed through time, along with the change in the amount of forested land in New England and in Vermont. This green line here shows how the forests were cleared for agriculture, with the height of clearing being somewhere around the mid-1800s, and then have rebounded since then. And along with that, many forest species have responded to that same pattern. This blue line here is actually whitetail deer. They were almost completely lost from Vermont. And you can see around 1800 there were almost no deer in Vermont. This black line here is beaver. Beaver were completely extirpated from Vermont by 1700 and actually are only here today because they were actively reintroduced. Interestingly, the coyote is a new animal on the landscape landscape we have today that has moved into this area all on its own that was never here before. And a lot of the animals that I showed on that last slide follow this same pattern. Well, part of the reason for that is that their habitat was gone with the wide-scale clearing of the forest for agriculture. But the story is a little more complex than that. This advertisement in an 1822 Brattleboro paper gives you a sense of some of the pressure that some of these animals were under as the settlers were arriving. Fur, fur, fur! Henry Blake will pay cash and the highest price for prime fox and mink skins. And fox and mink were not the only animals that were under pressure because of the value of their fur. In addition to hunting animals because they were valuable fur bearers, there was also a really different attitude about a lot of the wildlife back in those times. This is also from around 1822 Brattleboro paper. It's a report about a catamount being seen on the Green Mountains. And if we look at the account, we can get a real sense of how these animals were viewed at the time. It says an animal of the cat species of enormous size and strength was killed on Saturday the 29th in Roxbury. The party overtook the dogs at the foot of a tree, upon a limb of which, about 40 feet from the ground, sat a most frightful and ferocious animal, with the name and nature of which not one in the party was acquainted. 5 shots were fired, expending the balls and 5 links of chain, with no other effect than to wound and irritate the high-minded and terrific enemy. As a last resort, while the animal was waving her tail, darting vengeance from her fiery eyeballs, and threatening destruction from her extended jaws, one of the party loaded very heavily with powder and buckshot and lodged the fatal contents in the very mouth of the enemy. So it gives you not only a sense of a different attitude towards wildlife, but also the fact that it says that nobody in this hunting party had ever even knew what this animal was. That by 1822, mountain lions in Vermont were probably incredibly rare. This is a photo from the Putney Historical Society. I'm not sure who this is, but this person is holding a bobcat that they caught, and this is probably in the early 1900s. And so it's an interesting window into the fact that there were still some bobcats hanging on around the area at that time. And also, again, we see the animals dead. And in fact, bobcat had a bounty on it in the state of Vermont until the 1970s. So the attitude about that species is just recently changed. This is another picture from the Putney Historical Society showing a collection of pelts of raccoon and red fox, which are probably 2 of the animals that were able to hang around in fairly good numbers because of their ability to really live in a human landscape a lot more readily and hunt in agricultural lands and that sort of thing. Well, there we go. On to the next. All right. Well, as the forests have regrown, the landscape is basically starting to be able to express itself ecologically in the variety of forest, of plant and animal communities that we see on the landscape today. I'll explain that a little more in a minute. So we talked a little bit about the past clearing of the landscape for agriculture, leaving a mark on the patterns in the forest today. But there are a lot of other forces really coming from the character of the land itself that's shaping the patterns in the plant and animal communities that we have here in Putney. In the first of our series, for those of you who are there, you'll remember that we talked about the bedrock of Putney, how it formed, and what the patterns are across the town of different bedrock types, where you find them and their different characteristics. And those bedrock patterns are one of a suite of very important things that are influencing plant communities. We also talked about the superficial deposits, the sands and gravels and glacial till that were left here in the last glaciation. And also the patterns of how those things are arrayed on the landscape. And this is another layer of patterning on the land that's influencing the forest communities and that we see on the landscape today. We talked a little bit also about hydrology. And essentially all of these patterns are coming together to give us the characteristics of the forest that we see today. In an essence, the forests are expressing all of the variation and patterns in the land itself. So if we take any particular place on the landscape that has a particular bedrock type and a particular superficial geology type and a certain place on the landscape, we might get one forest community type associated with that. If we chose another place on the landscape with a different bedrock type and different superficial geology and landscape positions, we might get a really different type of forest around there. And Chris, in his talk, is going to really delve into this topic and talk about some real-life Putney landscape examples. Before he does that, I want to orient you a little bit about some general characteristics of the forests here in Putney. This map shows what are called the biophysical regions of Vermont. The ecologists have defined these based on big changes in climate and bedrock geology and the shape of the land, mountainous terrain versus valleys and so forth, that are all really influencing the character of the plant and animal communities in these areas. And here in Putney, we are in the southern Piedmont area. Putney is right around here. This map is showing rainfall across Vermont. And you can see how, for instance, the Green Mountains is creating a really big change in the weather across the state, with the red being the wettest areas of the state and the blue being the drier areas of the state. So the shape of the land has an incredible potential to control climate and thus also the plant and animal communities that live in these places. The predominant natural community type in the southern Vermont Piedmont is known as the northern hardwood forest. It's called a matrix community, which generally means that it accounts for about 80% of the total landscape forest type. Northern hardwood forest has three main species that characterize it. The first is American beech, which we talked about being such a dominant part of the pre-settlement landscape. Sugar maple and yellow birch. And these are all species that we find here in Putney in good numbers. But there's a little bit more to it. Where we are in Putney, right along the Connecticut River Valley, there's actually a little more of a southern influence, and the forests in Putney are a little bit more like the forests of Massachusetts than some of the other forests at higher elevation in the southern Piedmont. Oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. So we have to add a little bit of variety to the northern hardwoods, with red oak and white pine being two other frequent associates with those northern hardwood species. And then amongst this matrix community of the oak, pine, northern hardwoods, you have scattered smaller pockets of particular community types that can be very different from that, with different species that are responding to the characteristics of the local landscape. And Chris is going to get a bit more into that. I want to talk about one special community type that you have here in Putney that's one of those small little patches amongst this bigger matrix. This circle here is marking the general area of the black gum swamps that you have here in Putney. Here's a picture from the air, and you can see the trees in the swamp are turning red in the fall before the surrounding forest. In the first presentation, we talked about the black gum swamps being an important place where bedrock wells that most of us are getting our water from get actually recharged by these pockets of water that are sitting on the bedrock and allowing water to trickle down into cracks in the rocks that eventually may be feeding some of your wells. But these swamps on the top of Bear Hill actually have a really important biological value as well as that hydrological value. This is what they look like on the ground. They're really beautiful spots. And these swamps are characterized by the presence of the black gum tree. And this is a tree that really is much more of a southern tree. It's a little hard to see the northern edge of the range limit here, but it actually swoops down into Massachusetts. And there's sort of a discontinuous little blob of it that runs just up the southern part of the Connecticut River Valley there. And some ecologists actually think that it may be these little swamps are a remnant of a time when the climate was actually warmer, and black gum, a more southern tree, might have had a broader distribution in the area, and it's just been sort of abandoned in these little pockets where it's holding out as the climate has cooled. But black gum produces a fruit that's incredibly valuable for wildlife. It's very rich in nutrients and fats. It's eaten by a lot of critters. And that might be one of the reasons why this winter I found this set of tracks leading into the black gum swamp. Does anybody know what that is? Cat, yes, it is a cat. These were bobcat tracks, and although the bobcat probably isn't eating the black gum fruits, the black gum may be creating a food base there for some smaller mammals that may provide a prey base for something like a bobcat. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris now, who's going to talk in detail about the Putney Central School forest.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. I would actually rather talk about fiery eyeballs and destructive jaws of death. But I didn't prepare anything about that, so we'll talk about the Putney Central School forest. As Jackie was saying earlier, and Claire alluded to as well, I'm a graduate student at UVM. I'm just a couple signatures away from my degree. And my work really was focused on the Putney Central School forest, the property that's all around us here. And I got involved with it because teachers at the Central School recognized that they had this resource, and many people in the town, you the citizens, are out there often using the resource, but there hasn't really been a comprehensive examination of everything that's out there. So part of my, or what my task was to dig in, delve into this property and explore the natural and cultural history and see what I could tease out and look for stories on this landscape. And I created a report, which I have. I created a report which is just about being finished, and you're welcome to take a look at it afterwards if you'd like. That really goes into a lot of things I'm going to be talking about and much more depth as well. And this will be available to the town and the school, and it'll also be available online when it's finished. So if you're interested, we can talk more about this afterwards. And I wanted to take a moment to say a word of thanks, because although this report and what I'm going to talk about, I'm standing here before you, I really couldn't have done it without, I certainly couldn't have done it without the help of the town of Putney and towns beyond, and many people who are in this room who shared both their time and their knowledge with me, and even their homes in some cases. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share this with you. So I'm not going to talk about everything that's in the report. I'm just going to talk about a few things. And if you like what you hear, you're welcome to read and find out more. And we're going to do it from the perspective of natural communities. And a natural community really is just a fancy term for talking about relationships of plants and animals that you tend to find the same, you tend to find them together on the landscape. And it's an idea put forth in many places, one of which is this book called Wetland, Woodland, Wildland. It's a guide to the natural communities here in Vermont. And if you haven't gotten a hold of this, I encourage you to check it out. It's a wonderful book, really good resource for looking at the landscape. So here we are in Putney, and you can see a lot of patterns on the landscape. Tonight I'm going to talk about several of those patterns. First thing you can notice, there are a lot of certainly roads, and there are rivers. And here we are smack dab in the center of the Putney Central School. And if we move to an image of the town as a whole, this is a topographic image showing the 3D contours of the land. Just to orient you a little bit, right here we have Putney Ridge running north and south. This is the Connecticut River, and here's the Sackettsbrook Valley, Bear Hill, just to the right. And right here in the center is the Putney Central School. And one of the things you can see is that the property is situated both in the Sackettsbrook Valley, and it rises up onto the edge of Bear Hill as well. And what I really want you to take away from this slide is this undulating topography and the terrain, which really characterizes the town with these north-south ridges. And I know you've talked about that in previous presentations. So here's an aerial view looking from the south up the Sackettsbrook Valley. And right here is where we are, sitting at the Putney Central School. And again, you can see some patterns. You can see down below this wetland complex and forest land up above. And if we look at another shot a little bit closer up, these patterns become much more clear. So here's the Central School. We're seated right about there. Over there. And there's Westminster Road, and we have Sand Hill Road here. And again, the patterns that show up, you see these managed school grounds, and you can see a wetland area and some forest. If we look at, we can make a map of these different regions and really divide up the property. We have a total of 176 acres, which fall within the domain of the Putney Central School. And a small portion of that is school grounds that are managed. A small portion here in the pink is this managed sedge meadow running right along Sackett's Brook. This is Sackett's Brook right here. Along Sackett's Brook in this blue, you have a community which we call a shrub swamp, an alder shrub swamp. But really the majority of the landscape is dominated by this upland forest here in the brown. And when we look at a different image, that one, a black, it's playing again. There we go. When we look at a different image, a black and white image, you can see more patterns still. One of the real obvious features is this banding of light and dark, which corresponds to the light corresponding to the hardwood forest and the dark corresponding to more coniferous forest.
Speak a little louder, please.
Sure. So when we think about different communities on the landscape, is that better? A little bit more. Okay. When we think about communities on the landscape, there are several different components that go into determining the ecology of different places. You can summarize them with 4 different characteristics. One, topography certainly plays a big role, the highs and lows of the landscape. And that topography is directly related to the substrate that lies beneath. And the substrate plays a really big role in looking at what kind of communities we get, whether we have bedrock or we have unconsolidated sediments, and even what type of minerals are within that substrate. Climate is another big factor. And climate certainly is different here in the southeast part of Vermont than it is in the northern Green Mountains. But even within the Putney Central School forest, you have variations in microclimate directly related to the topography. And that creates differences in terms of how much moisture is there, of sunlight, and that plays out in the patterns of the vegetation that we see. Finally, the 4th component is here, this disturbance. And that can be both natural elements, such as water and flood events, or wind, fire, animals like the beaver, and also human influence, whether it's logging or influence such as agriculture or even mowing. So we're going to take all these components. What I'd like to do is give you a sense of some of the different places on the property. And I'm calling them stories in place. And what we're going to do is go to different places and look at how those four elements play out in different spots, of course. So the first place we're going to go is look at some of the logging roads that are up here. We're going to go along this Trail D, which is an arbitrary name for lack of a better one at this point, and consider what's going on over there. And when we go there, we see something that looks like this. Nice whisper of a trail running through the forest. And all around, the composition of the trees there is really dominated by this matrix community that Claire was talking about, of hardwoods. And it's not just all northern hardwoods, but we're in that area where you have this, the southern influences. So you get particularly a lot of trees like the oak, the red oak, the beech. In the understory, you have some shrubs like witch hazel. Down low in some of the drier areas, you got a lot of this. Anyone recognize what this shrub is right here? What's that?
Blueberry.
It is a blueberry, yep. Great for a nice summertime snack. Over here, another edible plant. Find down on the forest floor. This is Indian cucumber root. And if you were to dig up this plant and take the root, it's actually a delicious little treat. And there are other plants as well on the forest floor, some of which don't even have chlorophyll. One of them is this one right here. Anyone recognize what this is?
Beech drop.
Yeah, it is beech drops. And it's a parasitic plant that gets its nutrients because it can't produce chlorophyll itself. It can't produce its own energy. It gets it by parasitizing other plants, specifically beech trees. But it's not all just these hardwood species. There are these smaller pockets of other trees as well. Particularly, we have areas that look like this, with a lot of hemlock. And one of the major things you notice here is that there isn't much going on the forest floor. And that's directly related to this really thick canopy that the hemlock has. The hemlock you tend to find on many of the drier, rockier ridges. This is where the microclimate comes into play. And another plant that you find on the ground level, again, that doesn't use chlorophyll, is this one with the common name Indian pipe. And this gets its energy, again, by parasitizing both plants and fungi. There also are some inclusions, are these pockets of pine. And all of these different, both the hardwoods and the conifers together, really create great habitat for a bunch of different animals. Anyone have a guess at the nest of what creature made this nest? It's a bird. Well, you don't often see this bird because it resides way up in the canopy, but you hear it often. And this one happens to have red eyes. Yes, it's the red-eyed vireo. And I found this, actually this nest was closer to the ground. And they typically build their nests in the crotch between branches like this. It's a real typical pattern. So when you're out walking around the woods, if you come across one, it's a good chance that a vireo made that. And of course, there are other critters out there. We see things like the chipmunk, the American toad, which you can find both in the forest and agricultural settings or in your backyard. They're pretty much just about everywhere. And if you were to lift up several of the logs, you come across this little guy right here, a salamander with the red back, hence its name, the redback salamander. And it turns out that the redback salamander is actually one of the most abundant animals on the landscape. You don't see them all the time because they're hidden under logs. But I think in terms of biomass, they are considered more abundant than even deer. Totally. The trees, in addition, both to providing habitat, provide a major food source for many animals. Here we have the beech nut, and down below the acorns. And it is possible that there are black bear using this area. Now, in the time that I spent out in the woods, the field season I had was this past summer, and I didn't come across any sign of black bear, but I've talked to people in town who have seen sign of black bear in the school forest. And certainly up on Bear Hill, it is possible that that's an area where black bear are hanging out. The name Bear Hill would suggest that there are bear up there, although the original name of Bear Hill actually was spelled B-A-R-E. So, who knows? Is it? The roadside is. Several maps that you'll find will be B-E-A-R. So, there's an identity crisis. In terms of processes, there are a lot of different things going on. One, wind is certainly a major player. Knocking down trees, creating these tip-ups, and providing a lot of woody debris which you find on the ground. And this, in turn, provides really good habitat for a lot of the animals. Other processes, there are forest pathogens that are out there. And this is the healthy beech tree on the left. And to the right, this is an unhealthy beech tree. And this isn't related to the beech drops that we were talking about earlier. This is actually caused by a fungus, which is transported by an insect. And the fungus is called, well, the disease is called beech bark scale disease. And it gets into the trees. The insect sucks on the sap of the beech tree, and it transports this fungus. And what ends up happening is the bark becomes cracked and breaks apart, and eventually can actually lead to death of the tree. So you can see a lot both of healthy beech and diseased beech out in the school forest. And other patterns that we see out there are directly related to humans. So 4 stumps here. The top 2 are from the most recent logging on the school forest that goes back to the mid-80s. And we have an oak here and a hemlock on the right. But there are older ones back there, older stumps. Here's a stump that goes back, it's estimated somewhere between 30 to 35 years. And you can even find remnants of stumps which you wouldn't even think are a stump. You see this little mound there on the ground, and you go over and you kick it a little bit, and you see that it used to have some sort of woody structure to it. And these are perhaps as old as 50 years. It's not likely that you're going to find remnants of stumps that are much older than that. In this climate, trees tend to decay pretty quickly. Another sign of this logging pass is that you see trees that look like this. On the left, or this is the beech tree, and you can see it was cut off right here. But when trees are cut, particularly hardwoods, the rootstock stays intact, and they send up these what are called stump sprouts. And you can see that this beech has sent up a whole bunch of stump sprouts. You also see many of the oaks responding in a similar fashion to being cut. This tree is a red oak that was probably cut 20 years ago in the logging of the mid-80s. And it has responded by sending up these multiple trunks. You can get a sense of how big this tree originally was by drawing a circle around through the center of all these stumps. And so it's grown back really quickly, primarily because it already had this root mass intact. And you find these multiple trunk trees, or we call them coppice trees, all along the logging roads. Another pattern that you see associated with the logging roads, you have these open clearings, and sometimes they tend to be a little bit wetter too. And as a result of that, you get a lot of vegetation on the ground that you don't get in other places in the forest. For example, here you have a lot of ferns. Hay-scented fern in particular is what's down in this clearing. And then you also see patterns right along the edges of the logging roads. And you can't really tell from this picture. You can see these white birch that are along the edges here. You don't really see a whole lot of white birch in the forest. And where you do see it, it's typically along these logging roads. And one of the reasons why you see it is birch is a tree that, in order to colonize, it does really well on exposed soil. And these being logging roads, not too long ago, perhaps 20 years ago, when these trees seeded in, there was exposed soil right along them. And these birch came in, and so you see these rows running along through the woods alongside the trails, not because they were planted that way, but really because they seeded it naturally when the soil was exposed. So now I want to take you to a different place in the forest. to the Sandpit. I'm sure many of you have been out there and explored this place a little bit. And we're going to talk about some of the processes going on there. We go to the Sandpit, and it looks something like this. Big open pit of sand, with shrubs around the edges and trees as well. But not a whole lot going on in the middle. Now, the history of this really goes back quite a ways, to say 12,000 years or so, to the glacial history. And this isn't a picture, I wasn't around then, but you can imagine what it might have been like. And when those glaciers retreated and they melted, the sediment that they were carrying in the meltwater was deposited on the landscape, and often it was deposited into glacial lakes. And we know that Glacial Lake Hitchcock ran along the Connecticut River Valley, and there were tributaries along Sneckett's Brook. And it appears that the sediments that you have, the sandy plateau on which the sand pit sits, actually is a result of this glacial outwash. Excuse me, please. Do we have a battery? Can I keep it back up?
Sorry about that.
That's right. So it must have been a nice time. 12,000 years ago. Yes? Yeah, sorry to use the jargon term. What I mean by that is that you had meltwater coming off these glaciers, and in that was the water was laden with all this sediment. And as it hit a larger body of water and was deposited, all the sediment basically dumped out on the landscape. In some places it was a delta, in other places it was between a glacier and a hillside. But I'm just using outwash in the sense of water, borne sediment that were deposited. Thanks for asking. Okay, back to business. Now, we don't have any specific archaeological evidence about the Sandpit and Sneckett's Brook Valley right here, but we do know that the sandy plateaus along the Connecticut River and its tributaries were used by indigenous people for hunting and fishing. So it's possible that the area around the Sandpit was used as well. More recently, we do have evidence, though, that this area was used through colonial times up until about the mid-1900s for agriculture. And this is an aerial photo taken from 1948. And this area right here corresponds with this area right here, the Sandpit. Here we are, aerial photo of 2003. You can see patterns are a little bit different on the landscape. We have a lot more forest than we did have in 1948. And there's an interesting story that goes here of trying to figure out, well, why was it like this? Who were the people involved? In the story, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of it, but it does go back to a house which is right across the street here. I'm using the laser pointer. This is the James Fitch house. It was built in 1779. And the Hannum family, some of you may know the Hannums, they live here in town. David Hannum, his grandparents, Fred Hannum, was the last person to actively farm this land. He sold the farm in about 1940. There's an image that was taken from about where this house is that looks across the road. This barn is no longer here, but in this barn, this was a barn that held 40 head of cattle, and it was actually had one of the first mechanical milking machines in town. And in this field right in the background here that we're looking at, guess what's there today? You got, that's where we are right now. That's where the Central School is, right here in the background. But 60 years ago, it was a cornfield. And so this history, we can see some of the patterns of this history on the landscape. We go out and we start poking around the sand pit, and we come across some pretty straight rows of trees. And typically in nature, trees don't grow in straight rows. Sometimes they do, but typically they don't. And we also come across posts that don't really look like trees, and they're not because they're fence posts. And we get up a little bit closer, and we see that many of the trees and the fence posts are wrapped up in old barbed wire. And when you put the whole story together, it turns out that this was actually a pasture for cattle. This is where Dave Hannum remembers going out there with his grandfather when he was young, leading the cows out to his pasture. They called it Sandpit, it was called the North Plain at that time. But you might ask, why is it a sandpit? Because There wasn't a sandpit then. And that relates directly to the history of this road here, which some of you might recognize as Interstate 91. And it came, this is a picture from 1962 when the road came through, and sand was taken out, was excavated from this plateau to use as backfill for Interstate 91. And it's really as a result of that that people today use it for the recreation purposes that they do. And particularly have a lot of folks out there using it for motor vehicle use, ATVs and dirt bikes. And this continual disturbance both causes a lot of erosion because there's this constant moving of sediments. But another thing that it really does too is it creates habitat for certain trees and vegetation that you don't see in other places on this particular landscape of the Central School. Claire was talking about open-grown trees. This pine, white pine growing right here in the center, has a diameter of perhaps 3 feet. And you might think, wow, if we core that tree, it must have a diameter of perhaps, it must be 200 years old. But it's actually probably not more than 40 years old. And it's grown so big and spread so much because it's grown in the open, because it hasn't had a lot of competition because there's been continued disturbance of people being out there stirring up the sediments. Again, you see the sandy expanse with a lot of shrubs growing, early successional species of trees, early colonizers such as birch. And you get other vegetative species that you get include early successional shrubby species such as this one. Does anyone recognize what this is? It is in the raspberry family. It's actually called dewberry. Delicious. They're just out there in the sandpit. I'll leave some for the animals. And this is another species that colonizes, and there's a lot of it right around the sandpit. Any thoughts on what this is? Yes, it is buckthorn, it's glossy buckthorn, and it's an invasive species, which has really become quite dominant. And I just want to present another side to the invasive story. Certainly, invasives are on the landscape. And it's something that we need to think about in terms of stewardship and where we're going. But it's worth also considering that within the context of the school forest, the sandpit is really unique. Certainly in the landscape, there are different patterns as a whole, but within the school forest, it is unique in that you don't have a lot of this early successional habitat. And because you have this continual disturbance and you have this shrubby habitat, it provides really good habitat for animals such as this bird, a popular game bird, known as the ruffed grouse. And it actually relies on a lot of this early successional shrubby habitat. So you probably wouldn't have this bird here in the school forest if you didn't have the continual disturbance of the sandpit. So there's all different sides to the story. It's just important to mention those. Okay. I'd like to move on here now and look at this area which I'm calling the White Pine Plateau. And some of you may have been there before. It has a similar history to the sandpit in terms of glacial geology and the farming geology. But when you get out there, it looks a lot different. You don't see a lot of sand. And the trees you see are all these white pines that are growing really closely. And one of the reasons they're applying here, some of these probably seem to naturally. But we do know that when the farm was sold, it was sold to Dr. DeWolf in the 1940s. And he actually set about planting several plantations of white pine on the forest. And the sand here was, this area of the forest was never excavated for sand, and so these trees were allowed to grow. And one of the things you can see is that the trees are really close together, very skinny. There hasn't been a whole lot of active management in this area. Again, Claire was talking about the white pine weevil. There's all these crooked branch trunks, a direct result of the weevil here in the forest. And because they've grown so closely, if you take a camera and you look up like this, you get a shot, much like this one here on the right. And all these trees are probably about the same age, going back, seeding in or being planted in the 1940s. And they're some of the tallest trees on the property, over 70, 80 feet tall. And one of the reasons is because they've been growing so closely, they've had to compete with each other and grow to the sky. They couldn't grow out like that white pine did in the sandpit. And you can get a sense of which trees are healthier by the crowns. This one here has a much larger crown. It's probably outcompeting several of these other trees with the smaller crowns. So you might think, well, this is going to be pine forest forever. But then when you look down at the understory, you see that there aren't a whole lot of pine growing there. You have a lot of beech coming up, a lot of hardwoods. So then your thought would be, well, okay, this is going to turn into a hardwood forest. We have some white pine seedlings on the ground, but a lot of these other hardwoods too. But that's not the whole story, because when you start to look at a lot of these hardwoods, you see beech that look like this, which is all squirrely, kind of going in different directions. Any thoughts as to why this beech might be doing this?
Deer.
Oh, you guys are sharp. You're right. Well, I didn't know right away. I had to find this, and I'm sorry to bring in bathroom humor, but these are the clues you find in the forest. This is scat from the white-tailed deer. And yes, this is a deer wintering yard, and there are a lot of deer on this landscape, many more than there were, as you saw from the graph Claire showed earlier, perhaps a century and a half ago. And these deer are nipping on all the different buds, nipping all the buds off of these beech. And so you don't really have very many healthy trees in the canopy. You don't really have healthy trees growing down in the understory. And so it's really unclear what's going to happen to this part of the forest. That is something to be decided by the stewards of the land. The forest also, this part of the forest, the White Pine Plateau, provides some really good wildlife habitat. These are cavities carved by a bird. Any guesses as to what bird? I should have picked really hard. I should have picked like the flamingo. I will next time. It is the affiliated woodpecker, and they carve out these large nesting cavities. But they don't just serve the purpose of nesting for them. They also become really great cavities for other animals in the forest. Both down logs and the cavities of the woodpeckers are good nesting places for animals such as barred owl. And also Fischer will den in a lot of these down logs that you find on the ground. In this track, Claire took this image, Fischer track, just this back in February. And although you don't often see the Fischer running around, you can certainly see signs of it in its tracks. Okay, I'd like to take you now to talk about some of the vernal pools on the landscape. Because they're certainly a prominent feature, though they're much smaller than some of these other places that we've been talking about. And they're scattered about. Every one of these green dots is a vernal pool. And vernal pools, as many of you know, they're really these shallow ponds. And they're ephemeral, and they form in the springtime from the heavy rains from the snow melts. And they basically collect in these depressions, these low-lying basins on the landscape. And because of a lack of predatory fishing, there's really great breeding grounds, really important breeding grounds for all kinds of woodland amphibians and vertebrates. Now you might be thinking, well, why am I showing a picture of this geology here? The geology of the upland part of the forest is actually a key factor in why you have a lot of these pools. You think back to the topography I was talking about, this undulating terrain going up and down, and it's in these low-lying basins that you have water collecting. The other places you find a lot of the pools is along the logging roads. Because you have these depressions where the water sits, and it sits there just long enough so that the amphibians and the other animals can breathe. So you come upon a vernal pool, you might see something that looks like this. Now I know it's kind of far away, but you guys are sharp. Any guesses as to frog eggs? Okay, what kind of frog?
Wood frog.
Wood frog, yeah. You might have heard before I had some of the sound going. That was the wood frog that was chirping in the background. There's a wood frog, and their egg mass is close up. And they're really distinct from other types of amphibian egg masses, in that they have this large jelly sac with individual sacs, each egg wrapped up in its own little individual clump. But not all amphibians, or not even all the different animals using the pool use it at the same time. This is a chart here showing the reports of the breeding calls from different times of year. You can see that the wood frog tends to be one of the earlier species. And you're probably hearing them right now. Tonight might actually be a good night to get out and do some vernal pool exploring. But other species like the green frog really don't hit their peak until later in the season, closer to the summer. And it's not just amphibians that use these pools. You also get a lot of salamanders. This is the Jefferson salamander up in the left-hand corner. Invertebrates here, like the giant water bug, which is really pretty cool. So it has a neat social hierarchy in that the males actually carry the young in the back. This is a spiral snail. Here on the right, lower right, we have the spotted salamander. And this one, all right, maybe I can stump you. Who knows what this one is here?
Fairy shrimp.
Gosh. I should have gone with the water. So you have these different species using the pool, and it's really a race against time. As I said, they form from the water collecting from spring rains and snowmelt. And I took this shot. Last year was so wet, as you probably all remember, or maybe you forgot. But I remember well that it was really, really wet. I remember the mosquitoes. You might remember that as well. And this shot was taken right around sometime in June. And often the vernal pools are dried up by then. But it was just a few weeks later that it looked like this. It dries up really quickly. So these are important places because they're breeding grounds, but it's a short window of time that the animals have to breed there. And that's why they're really, vernal pools are considered some of the richest and most vulnerable habitat on the landscape as well. And that brings up this idea of buffers. And most vernal pools don't have buffers around them. But the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department recommends that there are buffers to protect vernal pools because of the importance that they present for breeding habitat. This pink here around each vernal pool represents a buffer of 100 feet, which is considered pretty much the safe maximum, minimum distance, to represent around a vernal pool to ensure that you're not endangering the habitat that's there. The turquoise here is actually a 600-foot buffer, which they recommend as more of a general safety guideline. But as you can see, the 600-foot buffers, that would be a good majority of the property. So that's perhaps not as likely. But the thing to keep in mind is that these are important places on the landscape for breeding. And you can see that many of them form along the logging roads. These yellow trails, these are all the trails and logging roads. And there's a real irony here because the vernal pools have formed because of many of these logging trails. But now that they're here, perhaps something to keep in mind is preventing additional disturbance because they can easily be wiped out. All right. The final place I want to take you on the landscape is right along here on the second foot. Look at this rich complex of wetland area, both right alongside the brook and over into the swamp down here towards the southern part of the map. And when we're standing on the Portal Bridge, which many of you perhaps have done, if you look out during the lush time of summer when it's raining, and it looks something like this, and you can see a lot of shrubs growing alongside the brook. And in the background, a few trees, some scattered trees, not a whole lot of forest right alongside the brook. And these shrubs are characterized by vegetation such as the speckled alder that's up here on the left. This is black willow here on the upper right. Let's see if I can stump you with these. How about this one on the lower left? Yeah, jewelweed, everyone knows it. Okay, how about this one? Joe pieweed. Well, those are some of the species that you see out there. I'll get you yet. And one of the main processes affecting what's going on here, as you might imagine, is water. So here's a shot on a nice sunny day this past summer. I was standing on the Portal Bridge and I took this picture. And what I want you to do is keep your eye on some of the sandy areas right here and up along the bank. Because the next day, there was a whomper of a thunderstorm. And the water was up that high. You can see how quickly the water rises. And that's directly as a result of this water. You can see it's all brown and muddy. It's carrying a lot of sediment. And that really affects how the stream channel changes through time. And so we get areas in the stream that look like this, these what we call point bars, the deposition of sediments on one side. And the other side, you have sediment being eroded from what we call a cut bank. And these sandy areas where there's a lot of activity and sands are constantly being deposited on a regular basis provide really great habitat for certain species that you don't see farther out in the floodplain where it's a little more calm. And one of those species is this right here, which you probably recognize as fiddleheads, or rather the Ostrich Fern. And there are lots of fiddleheads growing right along, actually right near the Portal Bridge. And if you happen to like fiddleheads, because they're delicious, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to pick them, and they are delicious to cook up, but just be cognizant of the fact that fiddleheads are really important. These are actually this is the way the plant gets its energy. This is the vegetative part of the plant that uses for its energy for reproduction and all. So if there are perhaps 8 stems or whatever, if you take all 8, then the plant's going to die. And not that you would. I think people here would probably be cognizant of that. So maybe 1 or 2 from each plant would probably be a safe thing. Or none. You can just admire its beauty as it is. Also associated with the water, during those big storm events, you get all this debris moving downstream, and it gets dropped out and creates these debris jams, which both changes the way the water flows and creates really great habitat for a lot of animals, such as the otter and the mink. And sometimes you get a real big storm, and things are just right to change. And if you look at this aerial photo from 1948, I'm going to zoom in here on part of it, you can see that the stream used to go around this bend. And at some point between 1948 and the year 2000, I don't know when, but enough water came through to cut that bend off. And so this is where the stream flows today. It's created what we call this oxbow as a remnant of the former stream channel. This actually is another, this isn't that oxbow that I was just showing you, but this is another place that looks to have been a former channel alongside Sackett's Brook. And it's in these sandy areas alongside the brook with all the shrubs provide really good habitat for animals such as this reptile here. The wood turtle, yes. And this one here. Yeah, the garter snake. The garter snake, one of its favorite foods is to be earthworms. They eat something like 80% of their diet is earthworms. And I came across this garter snake. It was so exciting. Perhaps you wouldn't think, oh, it's just a garter snake going along. And I was watching it, and I went to take a picture. And then I saw it actually come up behind this earthworm. It was hunting. It was very stealthy, you know? Kind of like those ferocious eyes that had these big jaws. And attacked it, and I almost didn't have time to take a picture. It gulped it down so quickly. Another great spot to see sign of wildlife is right here along the beach, right at the Portal Bridge, is the bridge here on the lower right. And you get up close, and just about any time of year you can find tracks. Often those tracks tend to be Crawford. And other dogs who use the forest. But there are some other wilder canines out there and some wilder weasels, and this is the track of an otter. See, that's the one I should have asked you. Maybe.
A couple of winters ago, there was a lovely slide that the otters made.
Oh, really?
That you could see where they had run up the bank and slidden down and done half a dozen times.
Nice. Was there still snow on the ground?
Yeah. Yeah, just about it.
Very neat. So we've been talking mostly here about right along the edge of Sackett's Brook. But as you move to the east of the brook, just north of Sand Hill Road, you can see there's some different patterns. One, there's some open water. And then you see some different colors here. And we're going to go a little bit closer and talk about the area right between the open water and the brook. You see a lot of these shrubs growing up. And again, you have a lot of speckled alder. That's one of the most dominant plants out there. But you also see some of these other shrubs and vegetative plants. I might get you on this one. Okay. Who knows what this one is? Up in the right-hand corner. Ooh. All right. It's got close. This is actually the dogwood. I believe it's silky dogwood, although I'm not positive. The upper left-hand corner. It is a spider. Yep. Also known as common name of meadow sweet. And then down, in terms of vegetative plants, we have this one here, which the common name is colt's foot. You can see it kind of looks like the foot of a colt. And around the edge, you have a lot of this beautiful purple plant. And it really is quite striking, but it is an invasive plant. And many of you can know that it's purple loosestrife. And it's becoming more prominent along the edges of the swamp, particularly where there's been disturbance alongside the Sandhill Road. This here? It looks like it might be a flower. It actually is the date of the camera. But if you want it to be a cardinal flower. So as you move away from that, in between the open water and so that shrubby area, you also get this this vegetative feature. And this is really, really unique. If you haven't been out to the forest, I encourage you to go out and check this out because it's pretty rare, at least locally on this landscape. This picture was taken from standing at that neck of land that heads out along Frog Highway, and there's a little campfire right there. And there's only about 7 or 8 feet of water here, and you might think, oh, you just walk across. I don't recommend you do that. I did that this summer, and I took 2 steps right in here, and I dropped down in the water up to my chest, which was a little bit scary. It was exhilarating, actually. But once you get past that, and you get out to here, you find out that it's really not stable. It's actually quite squishy, and it's a floating mat of vegetative matter. And you get a little bit closer there, and you see there are plants there such as marsh fern up here in the upper left. And there's also a lot of moss of the genus of sphagnum. And it turns out that this area, because of the hydrology and everything that's going on, it's turning into, it looks to be developing into what we call a fen, in that you have limited nutrients in this area. The sphagnum tends to acidify the environment. You have, the reason why it's all bouncy and squishy here and it's not solid is that this is floating mat of partially decayed vegetative material that's not breaking down completely because of stagnant conditions, low oxygen, low pHs. And so you're having this material which is building over time. It's about 3 feet thick right now at its thickest point. And if it continues, the open water that you know as the swamp may actually cover over completely with this vegetative material. Really pretty neat spot. And one of the reasons why you have all this water there is tied directly to the animals in the landscape, such as the beaver. Yep. These are trees that were carved by the beaver, and the beaver go after trees so they can build dams, as you know, right? A flooding area both for protection and also to nurture some of their favorite foods. And if you go out along the Beaver Dam Trail, which gets its name just because it actually is a beaver dam, and this picture was taken from the Beaver Dam Trail, and as you walk along there, if you were to dig down between the vegetation, you actually find sticks that were shoved into the ground that the beavers put there to dam up this little pond. And by doing that, it creates really good habitat for species such as the cattail. And a secondary benefit, it creates good habitat for other amphibians and other wildlife, such as the green frog. But it's not just beavers who are involved. There are we humans play a role in this landscape. And certainly Sandhill Road is a barrier, which is preventing the natural flow of water from going across from north to south. So it flows predominantly out beneath the beneath the bridge at Sand Hill, and there were some new culverts that were put in 2005. And you can see that this here is the girder of the old bridge. And it's about 1.5 to 2 feet lower than the new bridge of cement. And so the cement bridge is really, this barrier is preventing the movement of the water. And together with the beavers, this water is rising. And I haven't been around long enough to say, well, how much it's rising per year. But from talking to long-timers who've been around here a while, have certainly remembered times when this area, that today we call the swamp, used to be pasture land. And you can see the effects of this rising water. These are white pines right along the edge of the swamp, and they're yellowing. It's a term we call chlorosis. But it's because they got wet feet and they can't handle it. And you can see, here's an aerial image from 1939. This is right at the end of the Hannum's tenure of pasturing and farming the land. And this whole area that today we know as the shrub swamp was all pasture land. So it's really changed quite a bit, even in the lifetime of people that are still here with us. So I want to go back to this idea of community composition. We talked about several different places on the landscape, and just a few, and there are many more stories. But it's really these 4 factors that can sum up and say that the topography and the substrate and the climate and disturbance all play a role in determining how the vegetative patterns are distributed on the landscape. And I just want to express that although we've just been looking at one particular parcel of land, 176 acres, you can take these same patterns and the same tools and go anywhere. You can go into your backyard or wherever you work, whether it's down in the Connecticut River Valley here, or it's up along the orchards in the northern part of town. Here's Putney Mountain, or even in the center of town. You can use these tools and the same process to figure out what's going on the landscape. And I encourage you to do that. There are countless stories out there that is waiting to be told. So go out and explore. And I'd like to say thank you to both photographers.
So I wanted to extend some of our thinking about wildlife to the level of the whole town's landscape. This map shows, this is a product of some work that the state of Vermont did, trying to assess the quality of the landscape for wildlife habitat on the scale of the whole state of Vermont. The way this is mapped, the greener areas are showing places that potentially have the highest value for wildlife habitat. And as you get darker purple, those are the areas with the least potential wildlife habitat value. And you can see the center of Putney here is really one of the darkest purple areas on the map. So one of the major defining features is how much human presence is there on the landscape. And in some of these areas, it's not so built up as the center of town, but there's quite a few houses or open fields and other ways that human activity on the landscape is impacting the forested areas and other plant communities there that are serving as wildlife habitat. So this gives you a little sense of where some of the good wildlife habitat in the town might be. Can take that a step further. These are considered core habitat areas. They're areas that are greater than 100 meters away from some sort of human disturbance, whether that be a residence or a road or an agricultural field. So these are the core forested areas in town that are the most free from human presence and might serve as the core for habitat for forest-dwelling wildlife species. Well, we wanted to check out some of these areas and see what wildlife we're doing, and we had a chance over the winter to do some trapping around town and see what sign we could come up with. So we're focusing really on mammals here. And these are the 3 spots that we went to here in the Central School Forest. And then right over the other side of Bear Hill, just over the ridge line, this is where the black gum swamps are and so forth, and the Bear Hill Conservation Area. And then this northwestern corner of town, that's connected to this fairly large network of core forest habitats. This is up past the end of where Dusty Ridge Road dead ends. And these are lists, unfortunately, going off the side of the screen. Oh, can't be helped. Of the species that we saw clear, definable sign, identifiable sign of in these three places. And you can see that at the top of the list there are 4 core species that were in all of these places: whitetail deer, red squirrel, gray squirrel, and fisher. And then some different species in different spots. USRs, by the way, are unidentified small rodents, of which I assure you there is a healthy population in Putney. They're all over the place. Chris showed this picture before. This is a picture I took this winter of a Fischer track in Putney, and this is what the Fischer Trail looks like. Sometimes you can't identify the tracks really clearly, but often they do this bounding pattern in groups of 3. You can see these 3, 3, 3. And they have a bunch of different track patterns, but that's a common one. And boy, this track pattern was just the theme of the winter for me. They were just, everywhere I went was crisscrossed by Fischer. And I'll talk a little bit more about Fischer in a minute. So I want to just focus on a couple of animals that were in all of these places, namely whitetail deer and Fischer, and look at their habitat needs and how they might be using Putney's landscape. This is a breakdown of some of the larger core areas and what their area is in square miles. The whitetail deer has a home range of between 0.2 and 2 square miles. So on this map, basically all of these chunks that are outlined in red potentially could contain the range, the habitat needs of a whitetail deer. In contrast, the Fischer has a home range average maybe about 7 square miles. And if you look at the map, you see that none of these core chunks are actually big enough, just in one piece potentially, to actually support a Fischer in all of its needs. And actually, if we add all of these chunks that are now stripy together, we get an area of about 7.5 square miles. So that's about the average need for a Fischer home range. So you can see that the Fischer in town are really needing to move around. They can't really make it on just one of these patches. They need to be able to move between forest patches to be able to hunt successfully and fill all of their needs. The Fischer is a really interesting critter. They're actually very adept tree climbers, which is why sometimes they're called Fischer cats. They're not cats, but actually weasels. And I've heard them referred to as black ghosts of the forest. They've long been considered animals that potentially are associated with old-growth forests, animals that are very reclusive, and wildlife biologists didn't really expect that they would ever have particularly high populations, in part because of their need for a fairly large home range. And actually, these guys were very prized for their pelts and were hunted out of Vermont early on, and actually had to be reintroduced by the state. They didn't come back to Vermont on their own. They were reintroduced around 1960 because porcupines had become a big problem for the timber industry in Vermont, damaging trees. And this is one of the only natural predators of the porcupine, who could climb up in the trees, and they're agile enough to flip them over and get at their soft belly and not get the quills. So they were actually reintroduced to try to keep the porcupine populations under control, and they have exceeded all wildlife biologists' expectations for their adaptability and their density on the landscape. And the populations have increased a lot in recent years. So if we look back at these core chunks and then look at the quality, how the state has mapped the potential quality of habitat between these core patches, we can get a sense of maybe where the fishers might choose to move from one of these parcels to the next. Basically, the more green it is, the more likely that is to be forested as opposed to an open area or developed area where they'd be less likely to be able to make it through there. So the fishers that I tracked here on Bear Hill, these are examples of some of the areas where they might be able to get to some of these other patches of core forest habitat. And then if a fisher wanted to get over to this large area of forest in the western part, they might pass through this way. And then there's actually you can see that it's quite green between the patches in the western part of town, and it's fairly, I call it fairly permeable to wildlife in the western part of town. But this really illustrates the importance of the connection of these forest patches and the fact that it's possible to have developments in these areas that could start cutting off these core areas from each other and potentially resulting in the loss of animals like fisher on Putney's landscape. And some of these patches are already looking like a little bit more isolated in terms of the human activity around them, and the pathways getting to them a little bit longer and more circuitous. I want to focus on one area here. You can see this is a purple area. It's got quite a few houses in here. This is East Putney Falls Road and Cemetery Road branching off of it. And this is a place where an Antioch grad student, Alex Jones, who lives in that area, actually spent a fair amount of time tracking fisher. And this is very interesting because it's one of these purple areas that's not really rated as high habitat value. So it gives us a window into how fishers might actually be moving through parts of the landscape that are more built up. So this is a zoom in to that same spot. You can see East Putney Falls Road here and Cemetery Road branching off here, and then all of these houses. And this red path here is the trail of this fisher that he tracked for a ways. And there's a couple really nifty things that I wanted to point out. One, this is a beaver pond here that the fisher is swinging by, and it might be one of the reasons that he's hanging out in this area, that could provide some good hunting grounds for him. But there's a few things that this fisher does that are against our expectations for fisher. One, you can see here, coming really within maybe 30 yards of a house, right into somebody's yard. And another fun thing is, let's see, where is it that he does that? Right here, he actually goes right up Cemetery Road for a stretch, right down the middle of the road. And animals like us are often looking for the path of least resistance. So it's frequent that wildlife will use our trails and our roads and so forth to an extent, as long as there's enough cover and habitat for them to feel secure there. So fisher are still able to move through some of the developed areas in town. This fisher does manage to sort of skirt between the major clusters of houses here, and I would imagine that if the density of houses got a lot more dense, then it might start to deter the animals like fisher from moving through those places. I just wanted to mention too, in terms of animal movements on the landscape, this is state data based showing where various animals have been road killed along Vermont state roads. And here in Putney, there have been a number of moose and also black bears that have been hit both along Route 5 and along 91 here in Putney. And I just wanted to say, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I wanted to point out that some of these places where the animals are crossing the roads also sort of seem to defy where we might expect the animals to be in terms of there not being necessarily good habitat for them on both sides of that crossing. And if you look at the dates of when these animals were hit, the moose were almost all hit in May of various, and that's around the time when adolescent moose are basically being kicked out of the nest, and they're having to find their new territory, and they're inexperienced young animals searching for some place to go, and they don't really know where they're going. The moose population in Vermont has also just exploded. In the 60s, there were thought to be about 20 moose in Vermont, all in the Northeast Kingdom. And by 1997, there were about 2,000. And then today, there's about 5,000. So the moose are really, they're just being pushed out of the Green Mountains and searching for new places to go. So I think that's what we're seeing here, these sort of marginal populations and young, inexperienced moose just kind of flailing around on the landscape looking for a place to be. The bears tended to be hit in around October. And I think these are bears that was probably in poor mast years that were searching for fall foods, searching for some place they could get nuts and so forth to fatten up, and might have been actually traveling some fair distances at that point. And I just wanted to show, superimpose on these core habitat areas where the conserved lands are in town. Just to give you a picture of the fact that some of these core areas, there are pieces that are protected, but that a lot of these core areas are not protected. So they don't have assurance of persisting as places that can support some of the diversity of wildlife that's on Putney's landscape today. And I want to just spend the last few minutes of the talk focusing on a monitoring project that's going on in town on some of these conserved lands. In the western part of town on the Putney Mountain Association lands. For the past 7 years or so, a group of 10 to 15 local residents have been monitoring vernal pools on the Putney Mountain Association lands. And Chris was talking a lot about vernal pools and their biological importance. And these folks are really taking it in hand to keep track of this biological resource for part of the landscape and have a sense of what animals are using these pools and how those numbers might be changing or might be impacted by human activities and climate change and things like that. These are pictures of a sampling of those pools that people have been monitoring. And this is a picture that's kind of nifty because it shows the egg masses of 3 different amphibians in this one shot. We have here this glob is a hatched out blob of wood frog eggs, and alongside are what are probably spotted salamander eggs. And then there are a few of these smaller clusters, and you see these eggs look very white and opaque. Those are eggs that are not viable. And those are probably the eggs of a Jefferson salamander. And I just wanted to show some statewide information about a couple of these species. This map shows all of the towns in Vermont where the spotted salamander has been recorded. And you can see that it's quite ubiquitous across the Vermont landscape. But Jefferson salamanders, and these guys have a tendency to hybridize with other salamanders and make a dizzying array of odd mixture salamanders. This shows where all of these different hybrids of Jefferson salamanders have been identified in Vermont. And you can see that it's actually a much more rare species on the Vermont landscape. And I noticed that Putney isn't listed here. This is the state herp atlas. So those of you in the Putney Mountain Association monitoring group, you should send a report in about your egg masses because the state would love to know about that and put it in their atlas. So it's pretty special that the Jefferson salamanders are here in Putney. And it's great that this group of folks is keeping an eye on whether they continue to be here and how well their egg masses are represented in the vernal pools here in the Putney Mountain area. And if any of you are interested in getting involved in monitoring these pools, you should talk to Philip Hamilton. It's an amazing way to just get out in the spring and feel connected to a particular place on the landscape and connected to what these critters that are really all over the place, mostly hidden. are doing. And I just want to point out too, as the last comment, that these vernal pools are really probably found all over Putney's landscape. Chris showed how they were distributed in the Central School forest, and there are many more vernal pools across town. So if you have one near you, it's a really neat thing to just start keeping track of it, going out in the spring, learning how to recognize the different egg masses, and just checking it out and seeing if it is getting impacted by human activities that might be happening, or new development and that sort of thing. So that's it for my talk and for Chris's talk and for our series of programs. I did want to...
I have a question about the white pines that you mentioned in the sandpits around. And you said, what will happen when they go away? What's the lifespan of them? How does that relate to, say, lifespans of other trees that might be around? I sense that the end of them will be the end of their natural lifespan, but they're not redwood sequoia.
No. In terms of number, we don't actually know the lifespan. Perhaps Walter could address that.
Of white pine?
Yeah.
300 to 400 years. They're long-lived, even though they're shade intolerant, or medium shade tolerant.
What I was referring to really is the fact that they don't look really too robust. Many of them aren't getting sunlight, so some of them could perhaps live 300 or 400 years, but because they're not robust and it is possible that they could be susceptible to some sort of disease or something that would come in. And it's just because there's no regeneration of the pines in the below, it's not likely that the pines will continue. Yeah.
What's the difference between small and wet?
Well, wetlands is really what I understand are general terms of where water is on a landscape. There are specific delineations that Vermont says a wetland has certain qualities in terms of types of vegetation or soils that are certain types of soils that are inundated for at least 2 weeks a year. This is state to state. Vermont has different rules than the federal level. But in general, it's basically just a wet area in the landscape. Swamp specifically is a type of wetland that is forest. So we can talk about a marsh. Also, a marsh would be the equivalent of a swamp. That's mostly grassland or herbaceous leaves. And a swamp would be forest in terms of shrubs. Yes.
If the highway department had kept excavating, would all of Bear Hill be full of sand?
No. Yeah. No. So the terrace where Sand Hill sits, those sandy deposits continue to the east, right about to where the stream, that woodland stream, which has a new name, recently has been named the Hayfash Stream, the one that comes right down to the property. So the sands pretty much end there. From that stream east up Bear Hill is really glacial till and bedrock. So it's just that strip right along the second floor. Yes, ma'am.
The last program, Claire mentioned that there were Abenaki artifacts found at the Historical Society put out, and many of them have been found at the Great Meadows, which might have been farmed. And is there any indication that the Sackett's Brook Valley might also have been farmed by indigenous people? Were there any artifacts found in the town forest?
There are no officially documented artifacts found. There may have been ones that, people living in town have found or people farming that area have found, but none that, like the state, for instance, archaeological office has on file, or none that are actually known where the locations would be. So I haven't heard of any.
Sackett's Brook isn't terribly big either, but it is possible. It is a nice sandy terrace right above an area where that was probably teeming before it was dammed, but it had a lot of really good fishing spots, certainly for hunting up on Bear Hill. So although there's no evidence, I think based on what we know in other areas, it's possible that area.
Eric, I was surprised that the western, the three areas that you're looking at, animals, you said the western one had way fewer. And they didn't have coyote, bobcat, and I was surprised because to me that's close to the ridge line and close to the larger. Were you surprised, and did you put equal effort into that area, or?
That is a really good question. The most effort went into the Central School Forest. That was the place that we were able to, most people visited the most times. But equal effort was put into the Bear Hill Ridge spot and that western spot. But so much of it is really dependent on the day that you go and the conditions of the snow. And I think that it's probably just chance. Although actually there's a little more diversity of different habitat types in that area between Bear Hill and and the Central School Forest than really what you have in that particular area near the ridge line. And I think that really accounts for it. I mean, the Central School Forest, it's no accident that there's so many animals there. That's not just sampling. There's really a lot of wildlife. There's so much habitat diversity with the wetlands and the uplands. And then on the other side of Bear Hill, the black gum swamps. And the areas I went through up near Dusty Ridge Road, the forests were much more uniform really there, and there weren't wetlands. And so I think that's probably a big part of it. Steve?
Larry, in your first presentation, you talked about the north-south orientation up and down on the ridge, why that was very good for the raptors. Are there animals at all that would live on one side of the mountain versus the other side of the mountain? Like it seemed to be with a north-south orientation. Anything east to west that might get different animals? Wouldn't cross, let's say, the ridge line?
I don't think so. Certainly, like the larger ranging mammals, that wouldn't be any impediment. And the smaller mammals, a lot of their populations are really, dispersed across the landscape. But, there might be small patches of, animals that are sort of rare that might be using a habitat like is it Grassy Brook that runs through Brookline there? That might be you might find some different small mammals in there or something, but I don't know that it would really relate to the ridge line per se, being a barrier or.
And you also said that the fishes came in to take care of the porcupine. How are the porcupines doing?
Does anybody know about porcupine?
There are very few porcupines, pretty much the dog.
Interesting.
I've never had a problem with porcupines.
And that may have to do with the number of denning sites and so forth, and they really tend to like really rocky, bouldery slopes to make their dens. And there certainly are some rocky, ridgy places around.
Yeah.
I don't know if.
I was really surprised not to see any sign at all. I didn't even see any old sign. Well, yeah. Sampling issue, and I was looking at one particular property, but the school forest, I think, would have some good habitat if they wanted to. I think we had some questions in the front row.
I have not a question, but I happen to live up the western part where you were talking about. And I have seen in the last 5 years, I have seen moose, bear 3 times. What else was there in the last year? Porcupines I haven't seen recently, but Fishers, I mean, they used to be there, our dog had them all the time.
Oh yeah, well Fischer was one of the things we found
But
there.
Fisher don't seem to be afraid of coming to where chickens are.
Yes, and actually Fisher have started to get a reputation for going after chickens primarily. And, I don't know that they've become a really big nuisance yet, but also they will potentially go after small pets. So if you look on like the Mass Wildlife website, they recommend, keeping cats inside if there are Fisher around, and, really if you have chickens, really try to have them in a secure coop, because they'll get in there potentially. Barrett?
There have been cycles of times I know in certain places around town where people have lost cats. Like in certain residential regions where 2, 3, 4 cats have gone missing at certain times it was attributed to Fisher.
And certainly as the wildlife really, fill the landscape, there there are more of those kind of people-wildlife interactions, and some of them are not really favorable.
Well, that was related to my question as well. Your map showing the trails that the Fischer cat took, it looked like the Fischer cat was coming pretty close to quite a few houses.
Yeah.
And I've lost 3 cats in 15 years. I assume it's probably Fischer. Is the Fischer cat nocturnal? Does it come out at night? And that's when it travels around?
Yeah, pretty much. It might be in also the early dawn and, dusk hours, but I think they're.
Because I live in an area close to the village. There's an awful lot of wildlife close to the village.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing actually how much there is. And I just want to say Laura's comment that she sees a lot of bear and moose and stuff out where she is in the western part of town. Well, the fact that we didn't necessarily see as much diversity there doesn't mean that, there aren't bear coming through that area or using that area or moose or some of these other things too. So I just wanted to say that it's always a bit of a crapshoot when you do tracking. If you're not doing it really, you don't have the time to go back and be scientific about it. So it's more meant to be sort of suggestive.
When you mentioned that a fish needs 7.5 square miles range to gather its food, that's not per fisher, obviously. Like in that 7.5 square miles, how many fisher might there be?
Well, there are some studies that indicated that at least a wintertime density was, I think it was 2 fishers per 10 square kilometers, which is like maybe, 5 square miles, 6 square miles or something like that. So yeah, I'm guessing it's probably a little bit more dense than that. It's probably a couple fisher per 3 square miles or something like that. So there are multiple fishers potentially occupying all of those good sites in town. But I did wonder when I came across tracks in different places, is this the same animal? And in some instances, it may have been the same animal. And certainly the Central School Forest and the Bear Hill area, that was very likely the same animal that we were seeing the tracks of. But I don't really have a good sense of how many fisher there would be supported by land at Putney.
So that just seems surprising.
That it's not more dense?
A little critter like that, there's only a couple of them.
Especially considering how many cats have been lost by owners in this group who probably live within 3 square miles.
We've had 3 red foxes die on our property in the last 12 months.
From no obvious cause.
No obvious cause.
And so did you find the bodies or?
One of them was, I have to shoot, it was paralyzed, the back leg was paralyzed. It hadn't been hit by a car, but it sort of staggered around and fell down about half a dozen times. And I left it for about 2 or 3 hours and then put it out in the delivery. One is, a lot of people have seen by our park, by the wetland. And one died, I just found its decaying body in our garden.
Since October, the kids found it back in January.
Wow. Well, I don't really have any insight into that. I don't know if there are any diseases that are, moving through the fox population right now. It's nothing that I've heard about. Has anybody else heard anything?
They be susceptible to rabies.
What's that?
They be susceptible to rabies. I think so. That's the way the stroke goes up.
The coyote attack fox?
It wasn't.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, sometimes if a population of an animal gets particularly high on the landscape, you can get more disease and more animals that are just, they're not really quite able to make a living, and so they're not very healthy and they're more susceptible to accidents and disease. And I don't know how the fox population is doing. It certainly seems like there are plenty of red fox. I definitely saw lots of red fox tracks around town, and lots of people have reported sightings, and but I don't know if their population is so big that they would be, you know, having a lot of members who were kind of marginal or.
I was wondering about poison. They eat rodents and poison.
That seems likely, and especially with them being localized in one spot. If there's somebody around there who's putting poison out for something, that it could be a localized.
That's what we
That's
did.
a good, yeah, that's a good guess.
My of neighborhoods during the great mouse population explosion on Warden Road, I don't know what happened to myself. It was driven, she felt, to poison the mice in our house and found dead milk snakes.
Milk snakes?
Yeah, they killed the predator naturally, eventually called them. Grandkids on
Yeah.
That might have happened. Because she had a direct connection.
What's that?
How about the barred owls?
I don't know. I don't know much about barred owls in Putney.
Can you repeat the question there?
She's wondering, she was wondering, feeling like she's been hearing fewer barred owls around and wondering if the barred owl population was doing okay.
We have a lot by us.
Do you?
I heard it once this summer in the forest.
The same thing happens.
There's at least one out there.
But we have a great horned owl now, and our barred owl there is gone. And I don't know if they just moved someplace else, thinking it was a dangerous neighborhood, to come back, or if they were.
I could definitely see them being kind of, you know, wanting to stay clear of a great horn. They're pretty fierce and actually a lot bigger.
I saw a report on television tonight that there's a big boom in the population of wild turkeys. And there's increasingly a lot of accidents between wild turkeys running into the cars, or running in front of the cars, whatever. And I've seen one wild turkey, a flock on Windmill Hill back a couple of years ago, but I've not seen another. Are there many in this area?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like lots of people are reporting. And then driving around town, I've seen big groups of them maybe 3 different times just on a lark looking out the window. So it seems like there are lots of them.
But I missed them sometimes.
Getting back to vegetation and invasives, would I be correct in assuming you think it's a kind of a lost cause or an act of God you just got to deal with it?
No. Invasives are really tricky because a lot of it comes down to we have the privilege of being the stewards of the land, and it comes down to priorities of people in different time periods. And certainly, well, for example, not an invasive species, but a non-native species, many of the beautiful trees that we have along Westminster Road, beautiful black locust. And it's not a native species, and it doesn't seem to be invasive and taking over. But it's part of the cultural history here now, and I think people might be upset if you all decided to cut them all down because they're not native. And, and I'm not trying to equate the buckthorn to that. It's certainly different and much more prolific and spreads much more quickly. My thought is that as townspeople, it's there on the landscape. The loosestrife, the buckthorn, other invasive species as well. Multiflora rose is all over the place, right along the brook. Those are just 3, and there are others. And my thought is really, well, those can be parts of the landscape and be controlled, or they can take over. And it's either a matter of deciding that, well, we're going to go and we're going to let it stay where it is, or we're going to contain it, which is maybe the easiest thing to do and prevent it from spreading to other areas. Or the town can decide, well, we don't want this to be here and we're going to clear it up. I really can't make the decision because I don't live here, but I think those are important questions to ask and to think about. And I bring it up and I talk about it in the report because there's all these stewardship issues to think about with school forests. Resources are out there. The logging roads were carved in. They're there now. They're terribly eroded. We can either do nothing about it, which is a viable solution, and whatever happens will happen. Or you can make a choice to say, well, we want this to go a certain way, and we're going to do something. So it's easy as an outsider to say, well, good luck. So what happens, but every community is dealing with these same issues here in Vermont. And I think that the important thing really to do first is start talking about them. And that's what my goal has been in bringing them up. So I'll leave it at that.
Do you have ideas, since you've been studying this, would you come to a meeting if you have any
Would I come? If I were invited, you're welcome. Thanks. I really only feel really confident to speak about the school forest. And unfortunately, I didn't do a Putney landscape assessment. But I certainly could speak about where certain patterns are in the landscape and how I think they can change.
I'd be happy, if I was invited to something like that. Sure.
We're really in the hands, out of our hands, put it that way, because you've got the adelgid, which might wipe out the hemlock. You've got global warming, which they say will wipe out the maple. We've lost the elm, we've lost,
Chestnut.
Chestnut, yeah. Things change.
Things do change.
Now we've got backbone. Thank you, yes.
That's in your perspective too. 4,000 years ago, hemlock wasn't even part of the landscape. And 12,000 years ago, I believe it was. So, depending on if you take a much longer time frame, then these are just little blips. But certainly, we live here now. And there are issues that we have to deal with.
Sir, do you know anything about the bees in Windham County? Because I hear that bees around the country are disappearing.
I have heard that too, just recently, so I don't know how it applies locally. Does anybody know about local bees? I've heard this thing about bees too, and bees not finding their way home and bees.
It's true.
Somebody said something about cell phone
Cell phones,
towers
right.
influencing their ability to find their hives again, which I don't know if there's any weight to that.
There's an article in the New York Times on bees today.
Really?
Yes, I haven't read it.
Interesting. Well, everybody go and find the New York Times.
It's supposed to be, according to the Germans, it's the cell phones, and they have this marvelous word, which I probably don't know how to speak in German, but it's like electrosmog. And the bees just get disoriented and can't find their way home and starve. It's very sad.
That is sad.
But it's more than sad. I understand that if the population drops far enough, that it may endanger our agricultural products.
It's your teenager on the cell phone or your life.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize how many bees are employed in like orchards, and there are people who actually, their whole work is to truck their bees around to different fields at different times when they need pollination, and we don't realize how much, a lot of our crops are depending on people raising bees.
Perhaps we'll have to develop an instrument landing system like the air. Put one on each beehive.
You see the flowers there. All the flowers have those runways on them. Just paint the hives that way. Perhaps that's a good note to end on. Additional questions.
That's worked on this PLACE program, and I hope that some of you will want to work with us in the next few weeks to design the last PLACE program.
Yeah, for any of you who have the stamina for listening for 2 more seconds, ignore me if you don't. It's part of the grant that we got to do this program covers doing this community gathering to talk about sort of developing shared ideas for where the community wants to go in the future. And as part of that, we have the grant covers a professional facilitator who's done these community gatherings all over the world and has had a really amazing success. It just did one in Dummerston that was really well received that Jackie mentioned before. So it's actually part of the grant to be able to have this facilitator and provide some of the resources, $800 towards a budget to make it happen. So that's just sitting there, and it's waiting for enough local people who are willing to donate a bit of time to actually do the planning to make the event happen. And a lot of people have heard about it. Some of you have been to informational meetings about it already. And really, I think it would be an opportunity lost if that didn't happen. Because I was able to attend the Demerston one, and it was just a really neat event. It was great energy for the community, great conversations, and people just really enjoying each other's company and sharing ideas. So if you think that you might be interested in helping plan that, please talk to Jackie. She's probably, or Louise, Ann, Carrie, or Pamela.
Pamela, talk to Pamela, but it's better to talk to Ann.
And there was a great article about the Demerston one you might have seen in the Brattleboro Reformer, but if you didn't see that, I can't remember what day it came out. I think you can usually find things online. So you might want to check that out and find out a little bit about it. And we're going to hopefully bring in some of the people who helped plan the Demerston event. So if you're interested, you can hear from them what it actually entails, what they had to do to make it happen. So anyway, I hope some of you would be interested in making that happen. And that's all. Thank you so much for coming. Yay.